All right, for sections 3 and 4 of chapter 14, I want you guys to understand how survivorship curves can lead to these growth patterns that we're going to talk about in section 5. So again, you do need to understand the difference between a type 1 and a type 3. Remember, type 3, we'll start with that one first, right? Have lots and lots of offspring because most of those offspring are actually going to die. They have lots of predators, right? So, like a fish laying thousands of eggs, hoping that one or two of those offspring will survive to adulthood, right? That had a specific curve, right, to go with it in terms of survivorship, right? Whereas type 1 was the opposite, right? The young are actually very likely to survive in type 1, and that's because those organisms actually help their young survive. So for a large mammal, like say a lion, they're going to take care of their cub. They're going to protect their cub and make sure that it survives to adulthood. So they don't have to have nearly as many offspring at the same time. Right? So we had those those three, because there's type 2 that's in between. But understand those survivorship curves, but also connect them to those growth patterns in section 5. Because type 3, when you have tons of offspring at the same time, right, you have the potential to have some exponential growth, right? And the exponential growth curve, right, was the one that looked like this, where you start out with relatively few organisms, but then it starts growing and growing and growing rapidly, right? And understand that that's a situation where that population is booming, right? Maybe some of those offspring did not get killed by predators, right? Maybe there's lots of resources at that given time, right? Maybe the conditions in the environment were good at that time, right? But those kinds of growth curves can only happen for so long, right? Eventually, it's going to have to level off or possibly completely drop off, right? So we have this boom or bust situation going on, right? So a lot of times with insects, and especially where we live, right, they boom when it warms up outside because they're dependent on their environment for heat. But they bust in the winter, right? There aren't any mosquitoes right now outside, but there's going to be plenty this summer, right? So a lot of times those type 3 tend to grow exponentially until they bust, right? Otherwise, type 1 actually tend to have more of that logistic situation going on. So you're supposed to have that idea in your packet as well, where you can only grow exponentially for so long before it's going to level off because there's going to be some kind of carrying capacity, right? Most things that are type 1 would have that kind of growth pattern going on. They're already at a carrying capacity, so even though maybe they could have more than one offspring, there wouldn't be enough resources to support that offspring. So again, this carrying capacity here that I'm just going to label CC, it limits the amount of organisms that can live in that area because there's only so much food, there's only so much water. So type 1, not only will their offspring survive, so they don't need to have lots of them just to make sure a few survive, but even if they did have lots of offspring, maybe they could have too many, right? So they're not going to have thousands of offspring no matter what, right? So if you're in that logistic growth pattern where you're already maxed out, it doesn't make sense to have thousands of offspring at the same time anymore. Whereas if you're an insect, like I said before, that in the summertime all of a sudden has potential, lots of resources in Nebraska, right? They're going to grow exponentially and they're going to have that type 3 growth pattern, survivorship. And it's going to lead to that exponential growth pattern. So it depends on the situation because, again, humans are actually in an exponential growth right now, and we're definitely type 1. But that's because of resources, right? Our technology has allowed us to access more resources, and it's actually helped our population grow in the last 100 years. So it depends on the context. Again, in order to grow exponentially, you have to have lots of resources, right? In order to boom like those mosquitoes in the summer or humans in general right now, you have to have lots of resources available. But again, those type 3s have a tendency to bust every once in a while, whereas type 1s only have so many offspring for a reason because there's this carrying capacity here limiting them, right? They kind of have to have one offspring at a time because then there's not enough resources to support more than that. All right, so that's all I need you to know for sections 3 and 4. Those were the big things for sections 3 and 4.